Great. Well, we're going to just spend some time reflecting once again on Isaiah chapter 40. And great to have kids with us. I don't know whether any of you got colouring pens and things like that, but I'm happy to give a prize to anybody who can do a beautiful picture of a hot air balloon, which is a picture that we've been thinking about. And we've been thinking about the need for refreshing and for a re-energizing of our lives through this passage in Isaiah 40. And we're going to just spend a bit of time reflecting again on that, and then we're going to get into groups of 6. The worship team are going to come back up and minister to us, sing, and we're going to pray for one another within our groups of 6 here in the upper room. And I encourage you at home, if you're in a household, to be praying for one another. If you're there on your own, please do pray and ask God to come. So we've been thinking about this wonderful passage, which is an invitation to those who are feeling somewhat spiritually distant and emotionally worn out and internally depleted to come and receive afresh from God. That's God's invitation to us, isn't it? That's his call. The prophet is pointing us to this inexhaustible, everlasting God, and he's inviting us to come and wait upon him. Calvin refers to God as the inexhaustible fountain of all good things. That's a wonderful description of who our God is. And so the invitation to us, again, is not to come and try harder. It's not to come and flap our wings faster or pedal harder. The invitation is to come and open our hearts and receive afresh from God. And as we do regather, as we do restart something in person here in the town centre and begin to have the opportunities as a church after a prolonged time to regather and come together, that really is what I want to encourage us to make our priority at this time, to come and open our hearts afresh and receive the Spirit. Like a hot air balloon that's lost altitude, this prolonged season has meant that we have, to some degree, I think, as individuals, probably lost something of spiritual altitude in our lives. But certainly as a church community, that would be true. We need to be filled afresh, don't we, with the Spirit, something the Bible invites us to do in the context of our gathering together. We need to know something of a fresh uplift. And I believe it's on the heart of God to give us that fresh uplift as we come to him in that way. Now, you may not think of hot air balloons as particularly dynamic means of air travel. You may not think of them as particularly efficient. And certainly from the point of view of an onlooker, if you've ever seen a hot air balloon gliding slowly across the sky, they can look a bit cumbersome, can't they? But, the reality is that with their ability to harness the power of jet streams at altitude, and the fact that they are not reliant on fuel to power themselves across the skies, a hot air balloon is actually quite a dynamic, efficient means of transport. They can actually move incredibly fast. In 1991, Richard Branson, you may remember this, and Per Lindstrand recorded a ground speed of 245 miles an hour in a hot air balloon as they crossed the Pacific on that record-breaking attempt. Steve Fossett in 2002 completed the first circumnavigation of the globe in a hot air balloon, and he travelled 31,000 kilometres in just 13 days. So these are incredible, dynamic things. And I think as the church, we can sometimes think of the church as something rather cumbersome, something rather static, maybe slow-moving, not particularly dynamic. What we read in our Bibles, of course, is that when the wind of God's Spirit comes in power upon his gathered people, the church becomes a dynamic community among whom there is great gospel advance. But it often begins with a process that involves a waiting on God, a coming to him to be filled afresh. So let me just read again from chapter 40 of Isaiah, and we're just going to reflect on what it means to wait, and then we're going to do just that. We're going to wait actively on God together. So verse 27 says, "Why do you say, O Jacob, and speak, O Israel, my ways hidden from the Lord, and my rights disregarded by my God? Have you not known, have you not heard? The Lord is the everlasting God, the creator of the ends of the earth. He does not grow faint or grow weary, and his understanding is unsearchable. He gives power to the faint. Why don't you say that to yourself right where you are? He gives power to the faint. And to him who has no might, he increases strength. Even youths shall faint and be weary, and young men shall fall exhausted. But they who wait, just say that to yourself, they who wait for the Lord will renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not grow weary. They shall walk and will not faint. We're going to think a little bit this morning about what this word wait means. What does it mean to wait? A strange word, isn't it? But this is the very thing that qualifies us to enjoy and experience the renewal that God so wants to give us. Throughout the Bible, we find waiting describes something really, really important that God's people are called to do. Waiting is a deliberate, patient giving of our attention to God as we actively pray for and anticipate his coming intervention in our lives. So the first thing we need to do when we hear this word wait is get rid of any sense of this being a passive thing. Some kind of passive passing of time where we simply press a pause button in life and wait until God decides to do something and to turn up. No, that's not what we're meaning when we think of wait. That's not what the Bible means. This is something active to be called to. It's a call not to switch something off. It's a call to switch something on in our hearts, in our posture. It's a term used frequently in the Psalms and the prophets. And in one sense, it's the thing that characterizes those who have faith, as opposed to those who do not have faith. So Psalm 25 says, none who wait for you will be put to shame. Psalm 37, those who wait for the Lord shall inherit the land. Hosea 12 says, hold fast to love and justice and wait continually for your God. But it's not just an Old Testament activity. In the New Testament, of course, the very first thing that Jesus commanded his disciples to do just before he returned to the Father in his ascension was to wait. Acts chapter 1, verse 4. He ordered them not to depart from Jerusalem, but to wait for the promise of the Father. And I think if we're going to enjoy something of an uplift over this season and over this time, then we've got to learn what it means to wait again on God. What's involved in waiting? Well, waiting is all about, I think, seeing God afresh. Isaiah is writing essentially to a people who have lost sight of God and God's purposes. He's prophesying over a long period of decline, a time of disappointment in the nation. These aren't the heady days of David and his great victories. This isn't the reign of Solomon and his great kingdom. No, these are difficult days that Isaiah is prophesying into. They're times of great transition. They're times of setback, and to some degree, they're times of the breakup of the nation. Times when God's people and God's city are under siege. And Isaiah also, as it were, prophesies to a future generation, a future remnant that would experience even more challenging days. They would find themselves having been reduced from being a great nation to becoming a band of survivors, a remnant. He describes them as a stump in the ground that was once a flourishing tree. A people who lived at a time when the temple had been ransacked and they had experienced exile, and they had as a result somehow lost sight of who God is. They're weighed down with disappointment. They are exhausted. They're no longer captivated by God and his glory, the Holy One. No longer excited by his purposes and the part that they're called to play in those purposes. And Isaiah does what prophets do best. He invites them to take a fresh look at God and who he is. And he reminds them afresh of what God's plan and purpose is. And he invites them to re-engage with God and his purpose. That's what the prophet does here. But it's not just information that the prophet's passing on. This isn't some kind of systematic theology of the doctrine of God that Isaiah is inviting them to consider. No, this is something that Isaiah himself has seen afresh in God. So we read in Isaiah 6 of that encounter, that experience. We read in that chapter these words, "In the year that King Uzziah died, I," that's Isaiah, "saw the Lord sitting high on a throne, lifted up, and the train of his robe filled the temple, and above him stood the seraphim, each had 6 wings. With 2 he covered his face, and with 2 he covered his feet, and with 2 he flew. And one called to another and said, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory." And the foundations of the temple shook at the voice of him who called, and the house was filled with smoke. No, Isaiah is inviting them to see afresh the Holy One that he himself has seen. And waiting involves focusing our attention afresh on the glory and the majesty of the God of Isaiah, seeing the Lord of hosts once again, encountering him in his majesty, being caught up afresh in his purpose. And so waiting is what you and I do when we turn our eyes to heaven and we say, "Open my eyes, Lord. Again, open my eyes. I want to see Jesus afresh." It's what we do when we choose to put aside distractions and focus afresh on the things that really matter. And strength comes as a result of seeing God afresh when we do that. What God's people needed in the days of Isaiah, this band of survivors who were carrying the weight of disappointment and exhaustion, what they needed more than anything else was to see God afresh. And I would suggest that what we need as Jesus' church in our day and generation is to see God afresh. Those who wait will receive fresh strength. Waiting is what we do when we turn our faces towards him. It's a deliberate act. It's a posture. Waiting is what the goalkeeper does in a major tournament when it's good old penalty shootout time. Maybe Jordan Pickford. He waits. What does he do? He stands on his goal line and he fixes his attention on the striker and in particular the ball. And he is making a note of every tiny detail. He is waiting. That's his posture. His eye is on the ball. He's focused. There's one thing that matters to him. Well, that's what it means for you and I to wait. It's not a passive thing where we just switch on our smartphones and wait for God to turn up. It's an active, deliberate, focused posture that we adopt. I don't think there's ever been a time when the possibility for distraction has been so significant for us, and when we battle to focus on things that really matter than the day in which you and I live in. So do you need to see God afresh? There's an invitation here to you to wait, to fix your eyes. Waiting also then includes reliance, deep reliance. Some translations actually translate the word here, wait, as trust. Those who trust in the Lord shall renew their strength. Waiting then, it's an expression of faith, isn't it? It's what we do when we actively rely on God and on God alone. That's what we're being invited to do at this time. One commentator says that this expression is merely a synonym for faith. It means to lean heavily on the Lord for strength. I love that phrase. Faith is all about leaning heavily And growing in faith is learning to lean heavily. Some people, of course, dismiss Christianity, don't they? They dismiss it as a crutch for the weak. Well, they've got it. Exactly. The gospel is the good news that despite the fact that we are fundamentally crooked and we are incapable of strengthening ourselves, we are fundamentally broken and incapable of fixing ourselves, God in his great love has done something for us through Christ to deal with that crookedness and to heal that brokenness. And the only thing that you and I are called to do in response to what God has done is to believe, to lean heavily on what God has done for us through Christ. But it doesn't end there, of course. Faith is what we continue to do. It's how we continue to draw on God. In the Song of Songs, which is a long extended love poem describing a passionate romance between the lover and the beloved, and on one level points to this relationship between God and his people, we read in Song 8 verse 5 these words, "Who is this coming up from the wilderness, leaning on her beloved?" It's a wonderful picture of how the lover has in the wilderness learned to lean heavily on her beloved. As the bride comes out, she does so leaning on her beloved. Well, as we, the bride, emerge from a prolonged season of wilderness, I believe we need to do so leaning heavily on our beloved, Jesus himself. And in many ways, the great lesson of the wilderness, the very thing that God is doing in our lives in the wilderness, is teaching us how to lean more heavily on our beloved. Bringing us to a place of deeper reliance. You know, in the wilderness, you will end up doing one of two things. You will end up wandering, drifting, and in some cases going around in circles and finding you haven't moved on at all, or you will learn to lean more heavily on the beloved. I wonder what you're learning in the wilderness. I wonder how you are coming out of the wilderness. Waiting is an expression of our reliance, our dependency, and that's of course why we don't like waiting. Waiting means we're dependent on someone else. No, we want a plan. We want action. We want results. And in some senses, we want work. What we don't want is to have to wait. We don't want to be reliant. So let me ask you, are you wandering or are you learning to lean? I believe we're going to come out of this prolonged season with many of us leaning a bit more heavily on Christ, hopefully, than we were before we went into this season. Next thing we find is that there is a call in waiting to persistent prayer. Prayer is the measure of our dependency. It's the way in which we measure our reliance, isn't it? Acts 1 verse 4, we read these words that we refer to, that Jesus says before he returns to the Father. While staying with them, he ordered them. It's a strong word, isn't it? Ordered them not to depart, but to wait. Strange, he's just commissioned them to go, and now he orders them to wait. Well, how did they interpret that? What did they do? Those that heard that for themselves, well, we know what they did because verse 14 of Acts 1 tells us. It says they went to the upper room where they were staying, and all these with one accord were devoting themselves to prayer, together with the women and Mary, the mother of Jesus, and his brothers. The command to wait meant gathering together with other disciples to pray. And learning to pray together is learning to wait together. Finally, we find that waiting involves a fresh, hopeful expectation. Isaiah is speaking to a people who in many ways have completely lost their hope. The glory days of David, the wonderful reign of Solomon are now in the past. Their city is now in ruins. He describes it in chapter 1. He says, your cities are burned with fire, your country is desolate. It's overthrown by foreigners, and the daughter of Zion is left like a booth in a vineyard, like a lodge in a cucumber field, like a besieged city. This glorious city, now it's like a flimsy one-man tent, an old ramshackle shed in the middle of a field. It all looks so desperate, so hopeless, so uninspiring. I mean, talk about a loss of altitude. And the result was that there was not a lot of hope around. There was a lot of cynicism. There was a lot of gloom and doom, but there was not a lot of hope. And their new narrative, as we saw last week, was God has forgotten us. The Lord has disregarded our cause. Despondency. The call to wait at such times of despondency is a call for us to recover a sense of hopeful expectation of what God is going to do in the future. Waiting is always future-oriented. It's not a call to dwell sentimentally on the past, the glory days of David and King Solomon, and oh, how wonderful it was. Neither is it a call to dwell on the present with all the challenges and obstacles and difficulties that we're currently facing. No, it's a call to look to the future. And when God calls us to wait, He's calling us to look afresh to the future. Waiting is what we do when we choose to patiently, hopefully look towards the future with a new expectation of what God is going to do. And whilst it's important we don't stick our heads in the sand and that we do honestly acknowledge and address the ways that this past prolonged season has impacted our lives, it's also important to recognize that God calls us now to look ahead, to look to the future with a new hope, with new expectation. God encourages us to trust that He is about to do good things, that there is recovery, there is restoration on the horizon. And Isaiah points them exactly to that in chapter 2, having described them as that booth in the vineyard. He goes on to say these incredible things about their future. He says, in the last days, the mountain of the house of the Lord will be established as the highest of the mountains, and it will be lifted up above the hills. And the nations will flow to it, and many nations shall come and say, come, let's go to the mountain of the Lord. That was the future that God has for them. They may have been reduced to a remnant. They may be overcome with despondency, emotional exhaustion, but there's an invitation now to wait. And as they wait, to find that God is kindling afresh hope for the future within them. So let me invite you to come and wait now. We're going to spend 15, 20 minutes or so as the team minister to us in song, praying for one another as we wait for the Lord. There's some questions, things to pray for that the guys will just